to the 4th Annual Food Justice Film Festival presented by the Center for Biological Diversity. I'm Linda Rico, Communications Staff and Food Justice Film Festival Organizer with the Center. Our discussion today centers around topics of migrant farmer exploitation as presented in the film Migrant Dreams, directed by Min Suk Lee. The film Migrant Dreams exposes the Canadian government's labor program that's designed to empower brokers and growers to exploit, dehumanize, and deceive migrant workers. For today's discussion, I'm very grateful to be joined by Sonia Singh, co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance. Before joining the FCWA in 2018, Sonia worked as an organizer with Labor Notes, where she developed trainings with Worker Center and union members across the US and Canada. She spent 12 years organizing with the Workers Action Center in Toronto, where she supported immigrant workers to fight for fair wages and safe working conditions and coordinated province-wide campaigns. Sonia is also a founding member of Justice for Migrant Workers, a collective which supports outreach and organizing with migrant agricultural workers in rural Ontario. Welcome, Sonia, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting us. Really glad to be here.
We're so happy to have you here. So let's just jump right in. So in the film Migrant Dreams, we quickly learn that the workers have virtually no access to any kind of support or information in their own language, and they're threatened and deceived into paying enormous fees to work at minimum wage jobs, packing the fruits and vegetables that we eat every day. I'm curious, within the organizing work that you've done and currently do to help migrant workers, what would you say is the biggest obstacle for them when trying to fight for better pay, safer working environments, and justice overall?
That's such a great question. And this film is such a beautiful film. I'm so glad that you chose it, and just showing all of the sort of nuances of how both what those challenges look like day to day, and also the very, brave ways that people resist and organize, from, very small actions like talking to an organizer like Chris or Evelyn or Kathy in the film, to, taking direct action with their coworkers. Yeah. So I think that, in terms of migrant workers, as they're sort of looked at, as the film highlights in Canada, to migrant workers in the US, which in the US, we migrant work could look like H-2A workers, a similar kind of tied work visa that's tied to one employer, like a SOT program or the other programs profiled in the film, or it could look like just people migrating from state to state, or have migrated from another country to work in the US. So I think across all of those different kinds of work, one of the biggest barriers, or it's sort of like a twofold barrier, is the fact that in so many jurisdictions, federally in the US, province by province in Ontario, depending on the province, farm workers are excluded from the right to organize. So just by having these sort of blanket exclusions to say you do not have the same protections as workers in other sectors, which in the US is a total legacy of the racism and exclusion from enslaved people in the South. And there's a direct tie to why we're agricultural workers and domestic workers,
right.
Jobs that were at that time done predominantly by Black workers. Why were they left out of federal legislation and continue to be excluded? So for sure, that context shapes so much of what we see in the US, but also that exclusion, in Canada, that all of those workers are excluded from the right to organize a union, or they have a very watered down protection. So that like structural challenge is hugely there, but then layered into that, these kinds of immigration programs are sort of overall broken immigration system where agricultural work is not considered high-skilled work, and it is considered work that guest worker programs can be used to fill labor shortages without extending status, without extending protections that match the absolute essentialness of the work and of what people are doing, and that it is very high-skilled work. So I think that or to the ways that people are forced to migrate to this country and work without status, again, not considering the huge contributions people are making to our food system. So that's just sort of looking at farm work in particular, but we can break that down in other kinds of sectors. And then, of course, just the huge challenges that exist in the US to organizing in the first place, even if you do have status, that's just our labor laws are really working in favor of employers and not of workers. But again, sort of like where I started with this film is like what's I love about it is that it really shows that despite of that, and despite of all those challenges, migrant workers find ways to assert their rights, their dignity, to dream of what is a better reality, what would be a reality that they were promised when they migrated, and thinking about their dreams for their children and their family, and how people find the courage to do small and big acts of resistance, which certainly we could share more about how we see that playing out in our member organizations.
Right. Well, how do you think it differs, like when you look at, the labor laws and migrant workers in Canada, and then now that you're doing all of that organizing work here in the US, is it still very similar? Are they very different? Like, what are the things that you've noticed are alike? Is anybody improving at all? What do you think?
The thing that's just so cool about the Food Chain Workers Alliance is we are a binational alliance, so we're able to create these spaces where organizations and worker-led organizations, advocacy organizations, and worker organizations broadly are able to find spaces to connect and share. This is what this context looks like in Florida. This is what it looks like in Ontario or Washington State, and this is how we're fighting back. And so certainly in terms of like Canada as a whole in the US, we see that there's often the Canadian seasonal agriculture worker program is held up as a model to emulate. And there's a huge push to expand the H-2A program in the US. And what we see is that the challenges that workers face under both programs are very similar, that when you're tied to one employer, it causes so many issues around being able to have a voice in the job, of all the kinds of violations that really are just by design. I think they say in the film, this is by design, are able to proliferate, even if it's not legal to be charged recruitment fees, even if you would have to be paid minimum wage, or there's protection around pesticide exposure. Employers feel emboldened to violate those laws. I think that so that context is very similar. The kinds of things that are pushing people to migrate are similar in both countries, absolutely, and where people are moving from. Definitely, there's some differences between our labor laws in each country, and I think that's one of the things that we try to create these spaces for people to say, to share what is a win that you've been able to make. In New York State, we were able to, working with farm worker members and a lot of a much broader coalition, win some really important protections during COVID to support workers to form health and safety committees in their workplaces, even after the public health emergency was declared over. And that's something that I know our members who are Justice for Migrant Workers profiled in the movie. Like, we need this in Ontario. How could we borrow this? Or like different states have been able to win some heat protections, and then other folks in other states are learning from that and thinking about how to demand something similar.
Yeah.
So we certainly see, like, state by state, there have been ways to raise the floor of what workers can expect to be entitled to, but overall we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear, though. It's so interesting because I think a lot of people don't realize how it works. Is it just some blanket laws, or is it state by state, how you're saying? So hearing that, I think is going to be really something helpful for our viewers. It's just it's a very complicated thing, all of this. And so the more information we can give on that and help people understand how it works, the better people can figure out ways how to support. So thank you for breaking that down. Another question I had was, there was this part in the film where there's two greenhouse workers from Jamaica. One's named Carlos, the other is Warren. and they were put at serious risk after being fogged and sprayed with very dangerous pesticides. Warren went to the doctor and he was told that the conditions were dangerous to his health, and he was actually diagnosed with a lung infection. Because of this, he was ordered to wear a respirator mask while at work, but his bosses told him to remove the mask or else he would be fired, because they didn't want the other workers to know the dangerous risks to their health. When Carlos confronted the bosses about the safety and the health issues, he was fired, and he basically stopped there. So in your experience, if or whenever you've seen things like this happen, where do the migrant workers go from there? You know, how do they continue to fight for a better life when they can't continue the fight at their workplace? You know, what do they do?
I think that story is so powerfully told. You know, in the movie, we see the images of what this spray look like, and that the kind of company officials that are applying it are wearing the mask, but are saying like, no, you don't have to wear it. It's safe, and you just know, like, if people know, like, this is you're not telling them the truth,
right?
And so, absolutely, I know that that's one of the biggest issues that many of the member organizations we work with who are organizing with farm workers talk about is pesticide exposure. There are certainly other ways that these workplaces can be so very dangerous as well. You know, there are members of ours like Alianza Agricola that's organizing with workers in dairy farms in upstate New York. Similarly, our members in Vermont, Migrant Justice, also really looking at strategies to support workers who are from wage theft to health and safety issues. I mentioned Washington State, things like heat, smoke from forest fires. So absolutely, like, this is a common thread that it's a very dangerous industry. And when people are tied to one employer, that retaliation can be so immediate, as we see in the film. And so I think that our member organizations that work especially with H-2A workers or migrant workers in Canada, where they are on these temporary visas, it is just a really long process of building, trust, supporting people to understand that this is to think about, like, what is the impact on their bodies from working under these kinds of conditions, and thinking about what are the ways to address and build an organizing plan or build a campaign. And so sometimes that's, many conversations and a long time building up. And I think what we've often seen is it's shown in the movie as well. Like, at a certain point, things just become so bad that there's no other option but to organize. And I think what the organizations that our members try to do is build the kind of infrastructure, build up the ecosystem of support, so that when workers are ready to take that kind of collective action, everything is ready to support them, from allies being able to call the company to strike funds being set up. And that's a big part of what we do at the Food Chain Workers Alliance is how do we help build that infrastructure to support workers who are organizing. So to your question of, like, what do you do if you get fired immediately after organizing? I think that absolutely can happen. And, we don't, I think Chris in the movie says it so well, like, we don't know if this is going to work, but we try, and it helps other workers who maybe come later. And in many cases, when we're able to support workers to talk to their coworkers and build a collective strategy, it can be possible to move the employer to take action and sort of get around that kind of retaliation. So not always, of course, and there's that retaliation again, it's just baked into these programs. But our members in Washington State, Familias Unidas, it's a farm worker union. They have done such an amazing job of building up that ecosystem and infrastructure, so that workers, they have supported H-2A workers to carry out, a 2-day strike, carry out work stoppages, especially one really notable one when a worker, Ernesto Silva Ibarra, actually lost his life due to these health safety conditions. Workers carried out a work stoppage and said, we're not going to work until you address these conditions. And of course, there was retaliation, there was consequences, but people in the community came out, and there was a huge push to not retaliate. And similarly, justice for migrant workers, since the movie was made, through COVID, there's just been many moments where workers did that kind of collective activity, and then our job is to be there as allies, just to support and make those connections so that there is enough pressure on the employer that is upfront as part of the demands, no retaliation. Of course, as we see in the movie, that people, if they do stand up and then lose their jobs, then that becomes a whole another set of strategies to support. How do we support people to have find a way to perhaps get a temporary status in the country? There are some new things that have been introduced in the US around deferred action that I think a lot of groups we're trying to sort of learn about and test out. How can this give a little bit of relief from immigration enforcement to then just, how to, sometimes people do have to go back home, and then how do they stay connected to our movement and justice for migrant workers profiled in the movie. It's just done an amazing job of connecting up workers, often people who have been injured and as a result of these kinds of health and safety conditions, and are part of an organizing network of migrant workers demanding better protections, and they're still contributing to this fight from back in Jamaica or Mexico or wherever it is that they are now not able to work anymore in the program. That's still organizing. So I feel like, to me, that is so inspiring to see that.
It really is. And it must be really difficult. It must be difficult doing it, because even when you're trying to help, these migrant workers, and when you talked about trust, building that trust, I can only imagine how difficult it is getting to that point, because they've learned quickly that the people who told them, they can trust them, they couldn't. So was that difficult? Like, is it hard starting out, or do they, I can only imagine how, where do you begin, working with people who have been just absolutely lied to and manipulated for so long, and trying to gain that trust.
I think, you see Evelyn in the movie in the parking lot. That's something that Justicia does a lot, go to where workers are at in spaces where the employer might not be watching. That those just being in the parking lot really regularly on the days that people are doing their grocery shopping. I think for other members, it's that similar kind of just outreach, many conversations through outreach. But I also think that when I've heard our Familias Unidas members in Washington State talk about when they have done these kinds of work stoppages, or won a contract for workers at Sakuma Farms, that's a way to really build trust. Other workers see oh, these people are the ones to go to. They won. They were able to win a union, and if they can do it, we can do it too. So I think that's sort of a escalating effect when we see those successes. Or I mentioned that our member Migrant Justice in Vermont, they have tried a really innovative strategy to get the brands at the top of the sort of food supply chain to be taking accountability, like Ben and Jerry's in Vermont, and then that builds in a layer of both protection but also access to farms for organizers and workers to be able to go out and do education. And that's a whole avenue that they've really been finding. It's helping to reach a lot of workers and build that trust.
I just think it's so wonderful. I mean, it must be very rewarding, feeling when you get a win, or even if you have one person who's now inspired to join and encouraged and want to join the fight, and all of that amazing work that you do. So I think it's wonderful. One of the other things in the film that was so disturbing was when you see these recruiters, these big recruiters who are making all of this money, and they tell the farm owners that they'll recruit migrant workers totally for free, no charge. But then they turn around and they actually end up charging the migrant workers to work. And they never end up charging these farm owners who are requesting the work. And, we learn in the film that recruitment fees are totally illegal, yet migrants are still paying it. They're paying almost $6,000 plus in recruitment fees, and these recruiters are forcing them to pay weekly and sometimes even daily. You know, it's so disturbing seeing that in the film and just seeing the fear that these migrant workers have. And I'm curious to know, in your experience, why is this imbalance so dangerous? And how are the migrant workers able to break out of this extortive cycle in a safe way? Maybe even when they haven't even met a person who's an organizer, you know, or even know about anything like that. You know, how can they get out of that, you know, safely?
Mhm. Yeah, no, that it is like really becomes into the terrain of I think forced labor. It's really like debt bondage. You know, I think that Chris in the movie uses the term indentureship. There's already like tying to one employer, but that debt really makes that even, you know, so much more entrenched.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, that it comes sort of back to those processes of building trust, of being in migrant communities. I know that I'm just thinking back when I was an organizer at the Workers Action Center, that we saw some of these cases, not only with farm workers, but with restaurant workers, where this H2A equivalent program had been extended to other sectors in Canada under a pilot program. And we saw that the same thing was happening. As soon as you set up those conditions, this kind of recruitment fees and taking advantage of people, of like that, all the avenues to migrate are so difficult and fraught. And so putting your life savings or like mortgaging your family's land or farm to be able to find an avenue that we were seeing that was happening. And I think hearing, you know, people who like the issue of your passport being taken away, or just not, you know, being you think like, well, in a rural location you're more isolated, but we were seeing this happening in the city of Toronto, and restaurant workers being told they can't leave the premises. And so in that case, I'm just trying to remember, like, how did one of the people that we worked with for a long time to really take this on after he had found our organization? I think that he had just really, it was like about being a presence in the community, that he reached out to a community member who knew, you know, another community organization that then connected to this community organization. So it's just sort of when workers are ready to take action, that how are there like community resources around that can be that way of support and break that kind of isolation. Because I think that, you know, whether the passport or the recruitment fees, it all kind of comes down to ways that that these employers or their agents sort of acting on behalf of employers can use control over workers. And that's one of the reasons why, like, we really are opposed to measures that increase the use of these types of programs as part of a path to immigration reform for farm workers or any other workers. You know, it's like, those are really extreme examples, but, you know, surveillance is described in the movie, like threats of retaliation. There's so many other nuanced ways that those examples in the movie are really dramatic and scary. And I think that they exist on a spectrum of other ways that workers are controlled when they, whether it's through this kind of program, or, you know, we also know that employers use the threat of immigration enforcement as a similar mechanism of control. And sort of until we have really like access to status for all workers and workers, especially farm workers, especially, like, these are just all different ways that people can be continue, you know, require indentured, as Chris describes, or like sort of tied to an exploitative work environment. And it's why really, like, status is the key. People need to come on any ties to be able to work without that kind of control.
Yeah, it's so frustrating, you know, when you see it in the film, and just when you read about it in the news and just hearing about things like that. You know, it's unbelievable that things like that still happen, you know, today. And it's just very sad, you know, that this is a part of our food system and a part of our labor system. I want to make sure we have time for some other stuff, but I'm going to replace one question with a new one. I am curious to know how you got into this field of work, and what inspired you, and why you love it so much, because it's wonderful. So I am curious to hear about that.
Great question. I think that it just was something from being a student and I was part of the sort of movement in the late 90s around looking at what are the connections between our campuses and global supply chains. And in that case, it was apparel. And how can we understand the power of these big brands at the top and support worker organizing internationally through lifting up workers' demands. And so anyhow, that was where I kind of entered it. I think that I then activists like Chris and Evelyn, who are in the movie, were people who just really inspired me around that time, they were sort of saying hey, it's not just workers that are working overseas in garment factories. We have these really extreme conditions of exploitation in our own communities, and workers also. I think that the first time that Chris and Evelyn, who are in the movie, were called to by community members, was workers had down a work stoppage. So it was also that workers are organizing with or without communities around them. So given that, what are the ways that, as allies, as organizations, we can build up to support more of that organizing? And I think that that's just kind of got the bug at that very early stage. So the farm worker organizing is really close to my heart, because it's sort of where I first started to see there's many ways that we can be looking at creative strategies to support just food systems in our own backyards, as well as, of course, not losing sight of the international picture. And then just from there, I was just really inspired to learn from other models and be part of organizations like the Food Chain Workers Alliance, where it's really a unique place that people organizing. We talked a lot about farm work today, but we also have members organizing meat processing workers and warehouse workers and restaurant workers. So to kind of bring all of this together and look at how do we take advantage of all of the different unique places that food workers are contributing to this supply chain, and can be then acting in solidarity with each other and doing learning from each other, building their own analysis of how they take on their employer from from watching movies like this, or from meeting workers who have taken action in their own sector or in a different way. So I think that's just really, really inspiring to be constantly learning from workers, learning from organizers, this long-term vision that we just are, ending these kinds of cycles of exploitation, and have a food system where people really go to work each day, whether it's in a warehouse or a restaurant or on a farm, and they can count on a livable wage, on safe working conditions, where they have a voice with their coworkers to change things and not face this kind of retaliation, and also not have to work 60 to 80 hours a week to survive, but can then go and do the things that they give meaning to their life outside of work, and support their families and have their families with them and not be separated. This is a really, we should have that now. So how do we get there?
Right. How do we get there? Exactly. I know. Well, I think it's wonderful. And I just think the work you do is great. I'm so happy that you could speak with us today. I wanted to give you some time also to talk to our supporters and tell them how we can support the work that you do, stuff that you're working on currently. Tell us the handles to follow, petitions to sign, actions to take part in. So floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that question. So I think, I'm just looking at my handle. I should have done that earlier.
It's okay.
And I should know it off the top of my head. I think we are so much in need of supporters who can, without, having to commit to being there when workers walk off the job. Of course, we would love that, but just there's so much that people can do by just following us on Twitter. So it's Food Chain Workers Alliance at Food Chain Worker. We mainly are uplifting the calls to action from our member organizations there. So it's a really great way to sort of have like a curated list of here, like all of the coolest and most exciting and courageous organizing that's happening across the food chain and how to support it. So that's just sort of a very easy way. We do also have an email list where we send out about 3 or 4 newsletters a year that kind of go in a bit more depth to sort of talk about here are some important wins, here's what here's some calls to action. So that's on our website. Yeah, those signing up for our email list, just then that's a great way that you can be very much in the loop when there's something really immediate, like workers are, foodchainworkers.org. Just, there's a call for solidarity. I think one of the things that we have been building over the last 10 years, we have a new report also on our website, you can find it, is really looking at how the broader food justice world is how we're able to come together across all the different places that food sort of intersects, environments, access to food, and kind of combating hunger, racial justice, and ensuring farmers of color have access to land. What are the intersections across all these different areas? And you're looking at procurement has been one way of getting our cities and institutions to agree to commit to those, principles or values to make sure that public dollars are going to uplift the best possible, values in all of those different areas. So that's another way that we would partner with organizations to get cities to pass good food purchasing policies or good food communities policies. So that's another kind of way that we've really built some strong connections with food justice organizations that we really, really value, and also really value when those organizations are able to kind of uplift things that worker orgs are doing, or policy fights. So we often have something that we're helping to uplift at a state or federal level. Right now, the Farm Bill is a big thing that many organizations are looking at, and we've been partnering with some different labor and food justice organizations to think about what are ways that we could make this Farm Bill, where that basically invests many, many millions of dollars into the food system. How could we try to make sure some of that is getting down to food workers in all different kinds of ways? So I think that, again, on our website, there's more information on how to support those initiatives.
Wonderful. That's great. I'll be sure to add those on our website also, so that our visitors can get all those links and make sure to follow you guys and follow everything you're doing. So thank you again, Sonia. And as a reminder to everyone watching, don't forget to sign up for this year's Food Justice Film Festival at foodjusticefilmfestival.com. The festival is free to watch all 4 feature films anytime from September 14th through the 17th. And you can also catch all of our 2023 virtual interviews on our site all year long. So thank you everybody for watching, and have a wonderful day.